All right. I know that this week is a little bit more challenging and demanding because I'm giving you three rather than just, well, not just, but two lectures. And so I'm going to try to keep this one relatively brief. Not because I don't think it's really important to examine race ethnicity as an important sociological topic, but because I think that I've kind of tried to knit race ethnicity throughout the entire class this past 6 weeks, or in the past 3 weeks and through the next 2 weeks that come are upcoming. And so you can look at it that way, that I'm going to try to cover this pretty briefly because I'm trying to incorporate it everywhere else. Race ethnicity is profoundly important. We're among the most racially and ethnically diverse nations on the face of this earth, and we are becoming incredibly diverse, even more diverse than we were in the past. And that will be part of what I discuss here. If you have an interest in this topic, I strongly encourage you to take our minority relations course and then to pursue studying race ethnicity in our ethnic studies programs and in our women's studies programs. So anyway, when we're discussing race and ethnicity, we're talking about minority groups and then racial and ethnic groups. And so a minority group is a subordinate group whose members has significantly less control or power than over their own lives than members of the dominant group. And so I don't necessarily mean that they're the minority in total, like in total numbers or in percent, but they're a minority group in terms of their political power and their access to society's life chances. A racial group is a group that's set apart from others because of physical differences that have taken on social significance. And so much of human genetic research shows that there's enormous overlap in our genetic, our composition as human beings. And that if you look at how humans are distributed in terms of talent, brain power, physical accomplishments, we can distribute it along a normal curve, and that there's an enormous overlap across all racial and ethnic groups and across gender groups. And so basically, sociologists are really interested in studying the social significance we place on being black as compared to being white, as compared to being Hispanic, and including the social significance of the different words we use to describe that. An ethnic group is a group that's set apart from others primarily because of their national origin or their distinctive cultural patterns. And so that's slightly different than race. So, for example, I consider myself to be Hispanic. I'm really proud of my Spanish heritage. I cook a lot of Spanish food. I speak Spanish. I love to hear stories from my grandfather and other family members about our life, our family in A Coruña in Spain. And I have even gone to Spain in order to visit family. But I'm white, and so I'm a white Hispanic. But it's very possible to be black Hispanic, to be brown Hispanic, to have a different racial designation while having Hispanic ethnicity. So that's like one example. So another term is prejudice. And so prejudice is a negative attitude towards an entire category of people. It's an attitude you hold. And so it tends to perpetuate false definitions of individuals and groups. And so again, I'm bringing up ethnocentrism, the tendency to assume one's own culture and way of life represent the norm or are superior to all others. And then there's racism, and that's a belief that one race is supreme and all others are innately inferior. In the United States, it's really kind of interesting to study whether there's been a rise of white nationalist movements and whether we're seeing kind of a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan because of this kind of ethnocentric prejudicial belief that the white race is superior to others. So I want you to understand that prejudice is talking about our attitudes. Discrimination is the actual denial, the behavior, the denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups because of prejudice or other arbitrary reason. Now, what's interesting is that discriminatory behavior can occur without prejudice attitudes. And so, for example, the way you might administer laws where you are paying one industry less than others, but for whatever reason you're funneling racial and ethnic minorities through that industry, you might not have prejudicial attitudes, but people are being differentially impacted. And so there's discrimination in that way. Or if you set criteria that deny an entire group access to an institution, that would be an example of discrimination without necessarily a prejudicial behavior or prejudicial attitude. Institutional discrimination is the denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups that results from the normal operations of society. And so these discriminatory practices continue to pervade nearly all areas of life in the United States. So an example would be institutional discrimination would be like our era of mass incarceration. So if you look at the criminal justice system, at every single stage, minority groups, particularly blacks, are treated more harshly and severely. So they're more likely to be arrested for the same crime committed. They're more likely to be sent to trial, more likely to be sentenced, more likely to be given more severe sentences, more the longer terms of sentence, and they're more likely to be differentially segregated in isolation. And so that's an example of like the day-to-day routine of an institution to have differential outcomes by race. In the past, until just recently, golf courses, for example, and country clubs barred access to their membership to racial or ethnic minorities or to Jewish people. And so that's an example. So when you think about it, I'm not really spending time this semester talking about it, but you could really kind of think through how does this provide privileges to the dominant group in society. And so in this case, I'm going to be talking a little bit about white privilege. And so by white privilege, I should have given you a number of readings on this topic, and you can study it in other classes. White privilege is basically the other side of the coin of race discrimination or racial discrimination. And so as you're going through society, if you're a white person, you rarely have a chance to think about your whiteness. You're thinking it's the standard. You don't really think any differently. You think that that's what normal society is. And so you can expect that on any given day, like when I get up here, when I wake up on any given day in Bowling Green, I have on my block one family that's black, and then that's it. I know that I'm going to see largely white people. When I go to the store, I'm likely to have a white saleswoman when I go to Calico sell me the candles I want to buy. When I go to my gas station, there's a white man who owns that gas station. When I go into work, my boss is a white woman. The secretary is a white woman. So I know that as I pass through my day, I'm going to be seeing a lot of white people, and I'm going to feel very comfortable. I won't even really be thinking about it. Where I board my horses, there are no people who are black who ride horses there, and there are very few people of Hispanic ethnicity, and there are very few people who are Asian. And so basically I take for granted that I am going to see people who look a lot like me, and that on any given day I don't really have to get out of my comfort zone. I'm going to go to meetings, I'm going to go to conferences when I stand up and speak. The majority of people who I'll be speaking to are likely to be white, and so I feel pretty comfortable. And so you should really think about it. How often do you go to social settings in which another racial or ethnic group is the one that is kind of in charge of the meeting, and they are the one who are disproportionately there in numbers? And so thinking about that, thinking about kind of comfort levels, thinking about it that way, I'd like you to think about how that can provide advantages to the dominant group. So for example, it can make parenting easier. A lot of research demonstrates that when a child gets hurt, like falls off a curb and cuts themselves, that minority families are a lot more concerned about taking them to the hospital because they feel as though sometimes the doctors, the white physicians, will look at them and wonder if there's been child abuse, whereas whites don't necessarily have to experience that kind of concern. School systems are likely to be looking at white families with a little bit more beneficial perspective than they might look at minority group families. Job-seeking advantages. We know that the research consistently shows that there's racial preferences in hiring that really have an impact on people's chances of moving up the ladder. So here you can see an example of this. Here's the median income by race, ethnicity, and gender. And by median, I mean not average income. Median is half the people fall below that in earnings, and half the people are above that in earnings. And so what you can see is that Asian men and Asian women are outperforming white men and white women. And so Asian men earn $53,000, $53,500, as compared to white men's $51,900. And then Asian women outperform white women by about $3,000, right? And then you start seeing that farther down in income, you find Native Hawaiian, blacks, Native Americans, and Hispanics, with Native American and Hispanic women at the very lowest earning range. And so, for example, you can see that Hispanic women earn less than half or about half of what Asian men earn. And so here we can see that we can stratify economic chances in life by race, ethnicity, and gender. Here's a little research that looks at perceptions of discrimination. And so these they look like spider webs. The top spider web is representing black respondents' points of view. The second spider web is Hispanic respondents, and then the third is white respondents. And so on the bottom left, you see kind of a little building that's got kind of, I don't know if that's money, green things. That's representing jobs. Or, I'm sorry, that's applying for college or university. So do people feel they've been discriminated when they've applied for a job or they've applied to a college? The second grid showing those people sitting at a table is applying for a job. That red house is applying to rent an apartment or buy a house. And then that little fork and knife is service. And so then what you see is that blue grid is trying to show you that people reported that they not often or ever really experienced, not often or hardly ever or not at all experienced discrimination in those fields. And the yellow is almost always or frequently have experienced yellow. And so when you see more yellow, that means that those respondents have reported more discrimination or more felt discrimination. And if you actually pay attention to numbers, this is showing you as a percentage, so 0 to 20 to 40 up to 100%. So when you look at blacks, you can see that over 60% report that they feel as though they've experienced discrimination in housing and in employment opportunities, right? And that very few of them have kind of reported that they never have experienced that. When you look at whites, it's practically the obverse, right? And so you see that 60% report that they've never experienced discrimination in how they've been treated at restaurants, in applying for housing. About 70% report that they've never experienced discrimination in seeking a job. Over 80% say that they don't feel like they've been discriminated against in seeking college education. And so you see these really enormous differences by race in going through life and feeling that the activities you need to enjoy life, getting education, getting a job, getting housing, enjoying the company of others while you're eating a meal, these are things that people have very different experiences of based on their race. When you look at poverty rates, we also have enormously different poverty rates by race and ethnicity. So blacks have almost a 30% poverty rate, Hispanics about a 25%, whereas white, non-Hispanic whites have less than 10%. And so if you look at this by gender as well, you would see even really harsher disparities. And so black women, especially black women who had families, have a really, really high poverty rates as compared to others. And so this is, when we're thinking about how we address social problems, we need to kind of reflect on why are there racial and ethnic differences in poverty. The last few things I'm going to talk about are the racial and ethnic diversity we have in the United States. I know that you know that we're profoundly racially and ethnically diverse. So when you think about Asian Americans in the United States, for example, 17% of Asian Americans are Filipino, of Filipino descent, 20% are Asian Indian, 13.6% are other Asian. We've got 11% Vietnamese, about 10% Korean, 5% are Japanese, and about 24% are Chinese or Chinese descent. And so we've got this enormous diversity depending on whether they're coming from Indo-Asian countries, South Asian countries, East Asian countries, or Asian, Middle Asian countries, and even South Pacific Asianers. And so they bring a diversity of languages, a diversity of cultures, a diversity of customs. When you look at Arab Americans, I know that we have like this perspective that we're dealing with kind of these stereotypes or negative perceptions, and that we conflate Arab descent, so kind of Arab affiliation to a particular Arabic nation, with religious affiliation. But they're very different. So for example, when you look at Arab Americans, only 24% report that they're Muslim. And in fact, more Arab Americans report that they're Roman Catholic or Eastern Catholic, and as many as 10% report that they're Protestant, 18% report that they're Eastern Orthodox, and then 13% report that they're either some other kind of religious category or that they're not affiliated with religion, that they're atheists or agnostic. And so it's important to really break that stereotype that we use, that we needlessly conflate religiosity and religious affiliation with nation of descent, right? Or a kind of a racial group of descent. Okay, so then let's look at Hispanic groups in the United States. When we look at Hispanics who are living in the United States right now, and I want to kind of remind you that Hispanic is just not a very useful term. There's a lot of political controversy about whether we should be saying Latino, Latina, or Latinx. whether we should call it Chicano, or whether we should just really specifically call people based on their kind of national identity in terms of ethnicity. But basically, you can see that about 65% of Hispanic people in the United States are Mexican or Mexican descent. 2% are Jamaican, 3% Dominican, 4% Salvadoran, 4% Cuban, 9% Puerto Rican, 2% Guatemalan, and 11% other Hispanic. So I would be considered other Hispanic because my grandfather's from Spain, and I really take a lot of pride in that. And so you can see we've got an enormous range. We've got even more diversity than that because we're seeing a lot more immigration from Central and South American Hispanic nations. So if you did a kind of a map of the diversity in the United States, I think this map is kind of interesting because it's showing you, like at the county level, those counties that have, if they have an ethnic or racial group that exceeds 5%, what racial or ethnic group kind of wins? Like which racial or ethnic group has the most people in that county? And so what you're seeing is that the green is showing you counties that are heavily populated by Hispanics or Latinos. The purple are Black or African American. The yellowish are American Indian or Alaskan Native. The bluish is kind of Asian. And then this kind of brownish orange is two or more races that are not Hispanic or Latino. And then the kind of palish grayish is that there's no minority group greater than 5%. And so what you're seeing is like along the west coast and in the southwest, you see a lot of Hispanic. In the Miami and lower Florida area, you see a lot of Hispanic. A lot are coming from South America and Cuba. You can see on the eastern seaboard, especially around New York, another a concentration of Hispanics. A lot of them are from Puerto Rico. We have an arrangement with Puerto Rico that you can be a Puerto Rican national, you can be a Puerto Rican and come back and forth relatively easily to the United States. And so we have kind of a binational relationship with Puerto Rico. And then you can see on the eastern side of Michigan, all along, Michigan through southern Illinois and part of Wisconsin, another concentration of Hispanics. In Texas, a heavy concentration. And then along the southern states and up the eastern seaboard, and in the Midwestern industrial states, you see concentrations of blacks. And so I think it's really kind of interesting to explore this. And then you can see, like in Wisconsin and Minnesota, clusters of Native American tribes, the same thing with Oklahoma, in New Mexico, and Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, these clusters of Native American tribes. I want us to stop and think about immigration. I know that immigration is a huge debate in the United States right now. So I'm going to say a few things about it. So in 1970, in the United States, I was 7 years old in 1970, 4.7% of all U.S. residents were foreign born, right? Who were immigrants. They were foreign born. Now in 2013, 13% of people who are in America are foreign born. And so more than 1 out of 10 people who are in the United States are foreign born. And we've seen a 4 times increase in the number of foreign born in the United States since 1970. So yeah, clearly immigration and the composition of our population is really changing. Right now there are 41 million people in the United States who are foreign born. If you look at that, in 1890 in our country, 14.8% of all people in the United States were foreign born. And so that was a time period in which we were looking at people arriving from Europe, people arriving from Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and that we considered it the great melting pot, right? Like it's this moment of a real amazing moment in our history. We thought it was the kind of the changing of America. And so we're almost at that level now, right? 13.1%. And what they're expecting is that by 2065, the number of foreign born in the United States could go as high as 18%. And so it is really kind of interesting to think through, where are these people coming from? What is the relationship to native-born people in the United States? Are they different in the number of children they have and their customs? What does it mean to be a foreign-born person? So as you're thinking about it, I want you to understand that 74% of those who are foreign-born in the United States right now are legal, like they are legally authorized. They've either naturalized themselves as citizens or have legal rights to be here. 26% are unauthorized. And so there you go. We have 74-26% split. So that's kind of telling you, what do we know overall? So when we think about how there's been world immigration, you should know that every year several hundred million people cross national borders to move to another place. And in fact, this is now a moment that makes the 1890s seem really paltry. The total numbers and volume of people that are crossing borders has never been as high as it is right now. That every year 3% of the world's population moves, right? But they're not all trying to move to America. They're not even all trying to move to Canada. They're not trying to get to the United States. In fact, when you look at it, half the people that move are kind of just moving like vertically. They're moving from one country that's a lot like theirs to another. And so basically I'm saying they're moving from one lower income nation to another lower income nation. And then the other half are people who are moving from a lower income nation to a higher income nation. So people who are moving to the Canadas, the United States, to European nations, that kind of thing. And then there really is a small proportion of people who are moving from the first world or the advanced industrial nations to lower income nations. Sometimes people move there in their retirement, right? They want to have a tropical home. Richard Branson bought himself an island. Johnny Depp, is that his name? Yeah, Johnny Depp bought himself a tropical island. Those are really high elite examples, but a lot of times people are moving from first world countries to lesser developed countries because they're going to work for a period of time in those countries. So my point is that think about migration globally. So for the United States, we've had these different kinds of waves. So yes, in the 19th century, we've had waves of people coming from Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, in different kinds of waves. And then we had waves of people coming from China. And in fact, Chinese immigrants were helping us with a lot of our industrial development, the building of our railroads, and they kind of went into specific kinds of industries of their own when they made their own Chinese communities within the cities. Chinese immigrants faced a lot of legal discrimination. So laws were set up against their kind of integrating into the population, and laws were set up that kind of prohibited whether they were able to bring family members in. And so we can see different ways we've treated races throughout our immigration history. And then we started to see the rise of people arriving from South Asian nations. And so, for example, after the Vietnam War, we had people arriving from Southeast Asia. We started to have people who are arriving from Mexico and Central America. We've had, for a long period of our history, a lot of relationships with Mexico, and the border was pretty porous, right? And so often people who considered themselves U.S. citizens were living on the Mexican side. Now we're seeing even more streams of immigrants coming from South America and Central America. And we know that that's been a really big concern because we know that often families are experiencing high rates of violence in their nations. And so they're trying to get their children into the United States, and the children are having really precarious and unsafe passage to the United States to get here. So that's like a big issue or topic. Since the 1990s, we've seen a surge of immigration from African nations. Starting in the 1970s, African nations started to experience a lot of civil upheaval, genocides, political and religious struggles, as they started to form kind of independent nationhood separate from colonialization or colonization. And so people have been fleeing persecution, they've been seeking political asylum, they've been coming for opportunities. And you can see different kind of places that they are ending up. So for example, in Ohio, we have kind of a pocket of Somali immigrants. Okay, and now what we're starting to see is we're getting more and more immigrants who are starting to come from kind of South Asian nations as well, but not as nearly as much as a stream of Africans and Europeans. And so we have really been a destination from all places in the world, and you can really see it in different kinds of streams. So for example, it went from Mexican to Asian and now to African. And so it's really sort of interesting to see how it's changing the racial and ethnic composition of our country. And so here's kind of a grid showing you people as they've been arriving in millions. And so you can see that in the 1880s through 1900s, we had these enormous flows of people. In the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, it's the same sort of thing, a surge in flows of people. you can see that there was a real contraction of it early 20th century, and that's when we really started to legally contract who we would allow to immigrate into our nation. I'm just bringing up these as facts so that as you're reading the papers and considering what our nation is going to do possibly for immigration reform, you might want to think through your own family heritage and the number of people that you know on a daily basis that are foreign born. All right, that's it for this week's lectures. You take care.